Okay, we will try to finish up lesson 12 today. We got through the first 12 verses and a little bit for the rest of it also. Excuse me. Uh, in chapter 25 of Acts, the last part of chapter 25, before Paul begins his defense in chapter 26, the last part of chapter 5 is basically Festus telling King Agrippa, who is now on the scene, King Agrippa and his sister um, Bernice, and telling the king what has transpired as the Jews have brought charges against Paul. And what it really boils down to is this: that Paul, as a Roman citizen, has done nothing to deserve being, first of all, in chains, but certainly according to his own statement, Festus has found nothing that he is deserving of death. What Festus sees and what he tells King Agrippa is, I find nothing that I thought I was going to hear some terrible things about this man Paul, but I found nothing. They brought nothing. But we also see that Paul knew what he was up against. He always knew what he was coming up against. But in this case, Paul played his whole card, so to speak, because as a Roman citizen, he doesn't have to put up with any of these lower level tribunals, and so he knew he was not going to get a favorable determination from Festus, and later from even King Agrippa. So his only resource then was to exercise his right to appear and present his case before the emperor, who at this time is Nero. And as we said last week, Nero was really two different people while he was serving as emperor. The first 5 or 6 years of Nero's um, governance was fairly mild. He simply went about, maintaining the status quo, so to speak, trying to maintain peace throughout the Roman Empire. But then, as a result of probably some very traumatic events in his own life, he sort of was a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde effect, because the last part of his um, governance was replete with just some real terrible persecution of Christians. Why the Christians? Well, that's the only people he could go up against. He didn't want to go up against his Roman citizens, or else he probably would have been assassinated. But certainly the Christians presented the greatest, threat to Nero being able to keep peace within the Roman Empire. And it was probably precipitated by the death of his mother. And that was because his mother was responsible, remember, for getting him into the emperorship at a very young age. She even was involved in the murder of competitors for that particular position, so that she got her son in at the young, ripe age of 16. So it was just before his 17th birthday. Got him into it, and for the first several years, she was really the driving force behind what Nero did. Nero himself attempted on a few occasions to kill his mother because of, I guess he grew tired of her continuing to interfere or to impose upon him what he needed to do, to dictate to him. And so he himself attempted to kill his mother, but was finally successful in the hiring out of assassins to have his mother murdered. But even at that, whether it was true remorse or not, he was seen as, and historians tell us this, of course, he was seen as very remorseful, even holding his mother in his arms and sobbing over her and expressing his love to her, despite the fact that he was the one that was responsible for her death. But whatever from that, he took on a whole different persona and a different governance. So Paul, at this time, this was in the first part of Nero's reign. I shouldn't say reign, his emperorship, because King Agrippa is reigning as the king. Paul knew that he could appeal to Nero and he'd get better. He would get a better verdict than he would at the lower tribunals with the Jews interfering, because this was in the first 5 or 6 years of when Nero was in the emperorship. So he played his ace card, his card in the hole, and he said, "I appeal to Caesar." Remember that Caesar and Augustus, there's another term, Sabastos, that were different terms applied to the emperor of the Roman Empire. And they implied and stood for different things. The most notable of those was the Sabastos. That was one that is still in use today, as a matter of fact. We have cities, we have people named Sebastian, we have Sebastopol right here in California, and other places. Those are all names that were derived from that ancient Roman term. But they were also called Lord sometimes. Different emperors would allow that term to be used for them, because with it was the term domini or domini, which carries with it a sense of divinity. Different emperors would allow themselves to be called Lord, and others wouldn't. Nero was one of those that allowed himself to be called Lord because that was his mindset. That was his mother's mindset at first. And then certainly after his mother was deceased, he didn't mind being called Lord, because, of course, that carried with it a much greater sense of control over people and a much loftier position. But nevertheless, Paul appealed to the Roman emperor, and so what we see here unfolding in the last part of chapter 25 and in chapter 26 is Festus relating to King Agrippa, who has now arrived on the scene. And remember, the king under the Roman Empire was not didn't have a whole lot of authority or a whole lot of power. It was mostly sort of like the royalty is in Great Britain nowadays. It's really the parliament and the prime minister that do all the governance of Great Britain. The king or the queen of Great Britain is like a figurehead, so to speak, and that's pretty much what the kingship was in the Roman Empire. Festus, as being the governor, was the actual real representative of Rome in this particular area. So he had the authority to set Paul loose if that's what he determined should be done. King Agrippa did not have the authority to overrule whatever Festus was doing. But it's very interesting, as chapter 26 closes, a statement that we'll see that King Agrippa made. It was kind of a dig at Festus, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So the last part of chapter 25, as I said, is Festus relating to King Agrippa the charges that have been brought before him. And he made his own statement that I see no charges that are worthy of, certainly not of death, but all I see here is he kind of sets it down as like a squabble, a religious squabble that's going on between Paul and the Jews. And the Jews are bringing charges because of Paul's belief in the resurrection. And that is at the heart That is at the heart of every time Paul gets in trouble with the Jews, so to speak, is because Paul preaches the resurrection. Why would his center focus be on the resurrection? Is that not the heart of the gospel message? Okay? That's the heart of the gospel. Why are we all here? It's because of that hope. It's because of that hope. So Paul's statement to Festus was, I've done nothing against the royal law. I've done nothing against the Jewish law. Everything that I have done is what I was commissioned to do. And he will detail that a little bit more for King Agrippa here in chapter 26. The last 4 verses of chapter 25, hopefully you've all read your text, is simply King Agrippa agreeing. It's not a matter of him agreeing because he couldn't legally, he didn't have the authority to say, I'll talk to him, or I'll have him appear before me and I'll decide. That was not the purpose of it. King Agrippa kind of appealed in a polite way. He said, I'd like to hear from him myself. And so Festus, as a matter of courtesy, and as a matter of probably not wanting King Agrippa to go back to Rome, or go back to Rome and tell on him, so to speak. Remember that he had just replaced Felix, who had been who was only around for a couple of years, and it was really the Jews that were responsible for getting Felix kicked out of the governor's position. So he was doing everything to appease both the Jews and the king. So as chapter 26 opens, Paul is brought in before King Agrippa. And what is very interesting is some of the things that Paul tells King Agrippa, which are, if you read them carefully, they're very profound, but they are also to King Agrippa enlightening, in the sense that King Agrippa knows everything that has gone on in Paul's life, because as Paul said, I didn't do any of this. This stuff about Jesus coming to the earth, Jesus hit the earth like an earthquake, really. He came into being. He grew up as a human being, set about teaching this new life that was to come, and went to a terrible death that he said he was going to have to do, and provided a means by which a new hope could be placed in those who were not part of the Jewish nation. Because remember, the promises that had been made to the Jewish nation only applied to that bloodline, so to speak, or to those who were proselytized into the Jewish nation. So that leaves a whole lot of people outside of that Jewish nation. If it only applied to the Jewish nation, that hope didn't apply to anybody else. That left a whole lot of people out in the cold, so to speak. But what Jesus did was, he said, no, 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 no. Every human being that walks on this earth and that will ever walk on this earth is entitled to this new life. And that new life is based upon the hope that was originally given to the fathers of the Jewish nation. And it goes all the way back to Abraham initially. Because remember, the promise that was made to Abraham is that through him all nations, all peoples would be blessed. And so Jesus came to the earth to set that in motion and put it in motion at his death, and really put it in motion at his resurrection. And so Paul begins to relate to King Agrippa everything, first of all, that he did as a Pharisaical Jew. He said, I did what I was supposed to do. I did what I was commissioned to do. You all know that I did that, and especially you, King Agrippa, because I have, all these things haven't happened just in some little corner of the earth. No, it happened so that everybody on earth knew what was going on, but especially King Agrippa, because within his family are Jews. Within his family are Jews. Felix was married. Felix was married to Drusilla, who was one of King Agrippa II's sisters, and she was a Jew. That's revealed to us earlier in Acts. And so King Agrippa was very much aware, and Paul says it, you know what the customs are, you know what the rules are, you know what the prophets say. Remember what this, and all I have done is simply tell people what the prophets and Moses said. That's all I've done. He makes a very poignant statement in chapter 26 when he says, if you understand who God is, do you find it incredible that God could raise someone from the dead? Puts it point blank. You all know who God is. King, you know who it is. And he's also, remember, he's still got the Jews all around too. And he's got Festus there. He said, do any of you think that God's not powerful enough to bring someone back from the dead? He is, and that was Jesus. And because the prophets said it was going to happen, he is the Messiah. And that he said, that's all I've done, is I have preached what the prophets and Moses said all along. And for that, the Jews sought to kill me. I said what their own prophets said. But because he was centered on the resurrection, who did he run in trouble with? Who did he run in trouble with? The Sadducees. So you see, this is the revelation to us that the Sadducees are really the ones that are at the real impetus of this persecution of him because of his stand on the resurrection. Because remember, the Pharisees didn't have any problem. Pharisees believed in a resurrection. They may not have believed it in the strictest sense of the resurrection of Jesus and all of those who would come later because of Jesus. But the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. And so it's revealed to us by the things that Paul says that they're really at the heart, of these charges that have been brought up against Paul. And then he says something also to King Agrippa when he gets through not only telling him, not only reminding them, he's really reminding folks about what he did as a Pharisee. He also reminds or says again, relates his conversion. Now remember that in earlier parts of Acts the 9th chapter and in the 22nd chapter, his conversion has been revealed through the earlier writings of Luke. But in this particular chapter 26, in verses 13 and 14 especially, we have some additional information that wasn't included in the earlier accounts. And I think scholars believe that Luke included it now because it drove home the point that Paul has been trying to make all along to King Agrippa. He said that the new information that's revealed is related to this light that's shown. He says in verse 13 that the light was brighter than the sun. That's how intense that light. No other part of his conversion has that ever been said. There was a bright light, but not to the degree that Luke reveals here. Not only did he see the light, but the light enveloped the whole company, meaning everybody that was around him was also included in that light. And that light was so intense that they were unable to see anything. He also says that because of that, the whole company, not just him, fell to the ground, but everybody that was with him also went to the ground. That's how it is. He also reveals that when Jesus spoke to him, it wasn't just some special language that he used. It was in Hebrew that the Lord spoke to Paul. And the Hebrew that Jesus likely spoke to Paul would have been the Aramaic dialect that was in use at that time. In verse 14, he also says that one of the things that Jesus said to him, that's not revealed in the other accounts, is, "Why do you kick against the goads?" Now, excuse me. Why do you kick against the goads? What does that mean? What does that mean? Why did Jesus tell Paul, why do you kick against the goads? What's a goad? Goad in this case. That's how it's spelled. Anybody live around animals, livestock in the country on farms or whatever? Okay. A goad, we call them prods. A goad is something you poke the animal with to get him to do what you want him to do. So it's an impetus to do something, right? But goad can also be verbal. Can also be verbal. People goad people into doing something by picking at them or saying something to them. And so when Jesus said, "Why do you kick against the goad?" What Jesus is really saying is, you are only hurting yourself by fighting me. Because what that means and implies is, what it means is, you cannot resist, or to resist anything is a futile effort. To resist, and in the times of when this was taking place and in earlier historical times, it would have implied that it's useless to go up against the gods, or certainly against God's will. And so to kick against the goad simply means to to try to keep God's will from taking place. And so what Jesus is telling Paul here is, what Jesus was telling Paul at the time he was persecuting Christians was, okay, that it's useless to fight me because I'm going to come out on top. But he also says then that Jesus said to him, "You're going to do something for me from here on. I've chosen you and I'm commissioning you to be my messenger to everybody, primarily to the Gentiles. But because of where Paul was at the time, and because he went about to different places, he obviously would have been in the presence of Jews. And so while he may have been speaking to the Gentiles, King Agrippa in this case, there were also Jews listening. So another question that, or another statement that Paul makes to King Agrippa is, because he knows King Agrippa is very well versed in who God is and in Jewish customs and Jewish traditions, he says, would you expect me to not fulfill a vision, a godly vision? He puts it just rhetorical and very matter of fact. So every time Festus or the Jews would try to go at Paul, Paul would simply go right back to King Agrippa and said, "What would you do, King? You're a smart guy. You know all about this. You've been around in your, what, 17, 18 years. But nevertheless, you're very much aware of what's been taking place." And so Paul continues to appeal to the king that whatever he has done, either as a Pharisee or as a Christian, was done because that's what God told him to do. As a Pharisee, God told him to do it through the leaders of the Jews. And as a Christian, it was because God told him directly. Jesus told him directly. And so he says, I haven't done anything that runs against the Jewish law, and I haven't done anything that you're not aware of has been going on. But the one thing that Paul continues to stay focused on throughout his ministry is the heart of the gospel, and that is Jesus was resurrected. Others say he's not alive. I tell you he is, because I saw him. And for that, the Jews continue to persecute him. While he's talking to King Agrippa, Festus speaks up and says, "Wait, you're out of your mind. Paul, you're out of your mind. You've got so much, you're so smart that we say that sometimes to folks, don't we? They're so smart that they're not very smart. Okay? And what Festus says is, all of that great learning that you have, because he knows how smart Paul is, he knows how well educated he is, has driven you out of your mind. What does Paul do? Does he respond to Festus? He turns attention back to King Agrippa. He may have said something to Festus, but it was really directed at King Agrippa. He says, I haven't said anything that's not rational. I haven't said anything that doesn't make sense. If you understand even your own law and your own prophets, you know that I've not said anything that is not rational. God can bring people back from the grave. And that's all I've said happened. And so he stays focused not only on the resurrection of Christ, but he stays focused on the fact that he has simply done what God told him to do. And that's all he's done. He's done nothing. In fact, what does he make the statement? I've done nothing more than what your prophets and Moses said. That's all I've done. And for that, I get persecuted. But I want us to go now to the end of chapter 26. And I want us to take a look at how this all comes to an end. Some really interesting dialogue. Let's go down to verse 30. Just before we get to verse 30. 28 and 29, King Agrippa makes a statement. He says, you almost convinced me to be a Christian. What he really meant by that was to act like a Christian. Because nowhere in the Bible and nowhere in secular history is there ever an indication that King Agrippa II was ever converted to Christianity. But because he was favorable to the Christians, he actually lived longer than any other of those who had persecuted or had gone up against Paul. And I'll talk about some of those in just a second. But let's go to verse 30. So the king rose, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with them. And when they had withdrawn, meaning the tribunal, okay, when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, this man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. So then turn him loose. No. Festus is not going to let him do that. That was the advice that the tribunal and king gave to Festus, but Festus was not going to turn him loose. And so verse 32, Agrippa said to Festus, and listen to what he says to him. This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. When did he appeal to Caesar? When did he appeal to Caesar? After he knew Festus was not going to turn him loose. Because remember, he was imprisoned under Felix. And so now two governors, back to back, put him in prison for things that were bogus. And what Paul knew, he was not going to get anywhere with Festus now. He said, I want to see the emperor. And so what the king says was, you could have set him free. He should have never reached the point at which he had to appeal to Caesar. That's basically what the king is saying to Festus. And the only, just a second, Brian. And the only reason that Festus was doing this, what did he say here? Because I got nothing to write to the emperor about him. Got nothing. Give me something, But Festus was in a predicament. He didn't have any legal basis to keep him in prison, but he was fortunate in one sense in that Paul did appeal to Caesar, because then that gave him the excuse to keep him in confinement and transport him all the way to Rome. And that's what the last, chapters 27 in the next lesson are about, is Paul's journey to Rome to appeal to the emperor to turn him loose. Brian, you have a question or a comment? Right. 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 Well, Paul knew what he was going to be faced with. The Lord had warned him what was going to happen, and I think this was an expedient way. He knew he was going to have to go to Rome eventually, and this was the best way to sort of put people in their place, and at the same time fulfill what he was supposed to do, and that was he was supposed to go to Rome anyway. And remember that he said, there is nothing that I won't endure for the Lord. And he knew that this was all part and parcel of him ultimately being transported to Rome. And in the next lesson, we're going to talk about that trip. It was a very bad trip to Rome. That'll conclude our study of the book of Acts. But I think it's what I find very kind of amusing, I guess, for lack of any other term, about this was that those people didn't even know Paul was putting them in their place. They either knew it and ignored it, or they didn't have a clue. Exactly, Jack. Thank you. Didn't have a clue. He said, you know what? You guys have been listening to the law that was delivered to Moses. You've been listening to your prophets. They told you all along, Isaiah and others said that there was going to be a Messiah come, and that he was going to go to a horrible death, and that he was going to rise up, and he was going to become the king of of this new kingdom, so to speak. There would no longer be a Jewish nation or a Jewish kingdom. And that happened, and you don't even have first of all, either the ability to understand it, or second, the courage to admit it. Because that's really what was at the heart of this whole thing was. Festus didn't have the courage to do what he knew he could do legally. He could have turned Paul loose anytime. Felix didn't have to put him in prison. Both of them had the problem of trying to appease the Jews. Now, perhaps in their defense, I guess, Remember that the Roman areas, all these different areas of the Roman Empire, were very much aware of things that took place in Jerusalem in terms of the Jews rebelling against Roman control. And there were even in history, it'll tell you that there were Jewish uprisals. And so whoever was governing in these different areas, it was about, for the most part, just trying to keep peace with the Jews. And that's exactly what Felix and Festus did throughout their governance. um, but ultimately, it was King Agrippa II who offered at the end, although he didn't have the authority to do it and he couldn't do it. Of course, the Lord knew that. Made the statement to Festus, you should have taken care of this a long time ago. And that's basically what it. King Agrippa II, while he came from he was the last of the Herodian dynasty, the last of the Herods. Remember that Herod the Great was the one who would be his great grandfather. Herod the Great was the one that had all of the infants killed to try to catch up with Jesus. Okay? His father, their father, Agrippa I, was also responsible for persecuting Christians. While King Agrippa II did not necessarily involve himself in the direct persecution of Christians, and at this point, of course, it appears that he became sort of hands-off, so to speak, in terms of allowing the Christians to do what the Christians wanted to do. It was revealed to us, and it is revealed to us through history, for instance, that King Agrippa actually received favor from God because of his more favorable treatment of the Jews. And we can determine that because of the contrast between what happened with other rulers or those who did an injustice to Paul and to Christians. Felix, of course, was recalled after 2 years. His family perished in the eruption of the Vesuvius in 79 A.D. Drusilla, who was the sister of Agrippa II and his sister Bernice, she perished with her husband Felix and her son in that same eruption. Bernice fell into public disgrace. Remember, she 16 years old. She'd been married twice already, and then even after that, she took on incestuous sexual activity. She even married one of her uncles, things like that. Okay, so she fell into public disgrace in Rome. She was referred to as the incestuous sister of Agrippa, of the king. Festus died within 2 years of denying Paul justice. When was it? What happened to the Sanhedrin? Destroyed when? AD 70. Okay, that was the end of the Sanhedrin. Nero died wretchedly and in disgrace. Herod Agrippa II, however, continued until the 2nd century because he was the lone individual that had any authority who did not impose any restraint upon or any injustice to Paul and the other Christians, even though, and it was only because he didn't have the power. He didn't have the power to overrule any of the governors that he did not allow Paul to go free because he didn't have the authority. But none of them could do that because Paul appealed to Caesar, and so he was entitled to, and he would be granted the way. So the big thing is, remember that Paul Paul always set an example as a Christian. Never did he back off from what his responsibilities were as a Christian, and whatever he said and whatever he did was because he belonged to Jesus. He belonged to Christ. And his total ministry was based upon his hope that he acquired when he was baptized into Christ, just as all Christians are. When you acquire that hope because of Jesus' resurrection, Paul was always focused upon that. And that was always at the heart of his ministry and always at the heart of whatever he did. And so then in our book, the author makes the point that a church that is an example to others will always continue to be focused upon that central theme, that central idea, which is at the heart of the gospel. And that is, because Jesus was resurrected, we know through our faith, and we carry with us the hope that we too will be resurrected. And that is why we want others to come to Christ, so that they too can have that same hope. Any final comments or questions? We even got done on time. Okay, so next week, chapters 27 and 28, lesson 13. And that will conclude our study in the book of Acts. Gone through the book of Acts.